I'm John Hager and want to welcome you to this video. We're fortunate today to have Dr. Rodney King join us for this Activism in Medicine Roundtable Forum. Dr. King is one of the most well-respected martial artists and trainers in the world. His work over time has evolved into an inner defense system that's relevant for all of us, and I think you'll enjoy hearing his perspective. Dr. King is a fellow at the Institute of Leadership and Management, a fellow at the Institute of Strategic Risk Management, and an advisory board member for the Transformative Leadership in Disruptive Times Certificate Program at Seton Hall University. We hope you enjoy today's forum, and thanks for attending.
Wonderful. So welcome to our conversation today. And I would like to just set this up with a little bit of framework, because typically what we have done in the past is we talk about two things. We talk about predicament and we talk about pathways. So what is the situation? What is the predicament for the modern human animal? And then what are some pathways we can take through that or out of that? And I know that, Rodney, you've got a lot to say about the state of the human animal, and that might be a good place to begin.
Yeah, so I mean, look, I'm going to just be totally brutally honest. I don't believe that I have all the answers, but I'm trying to grapple with this whole kind of predicament that we find ourselves in. I think if I have to kind of just simplify it, I mean, my position is this. It's very, very evident to me that the modern world is not good for us. And what I'm basing that on is, if we look around, there are people that are increasingly struggling with mental health issues. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. And as John Vervaeke, who's somebody we talked to just recently, puts it, is there is a crisis in meaning. And I kind of view that as the canary in the coal mine. You know, if we have to look at anything outside of the obvious, well, I suppose it depends on who you're speaking to on that, right? But it's outside of the obvious of, most people are aware that there is a climate situation, there's a climate crisis. But if we have to look at what I would feel is even more, pressing in our everyday life, because we work with people and we're around people all the time, is just their dissatisfaction. The fact that people are not happy. And for all the things that we were told that we should achieve, the materialistic wealth, to consume and so forth, we were told if we did these things, we would be happy. And it's very clear that people aren't. And so I think that is kind of the canary in the coal mine. That's kind of the indicator that things are not as well as people suggest it is. And so, yeah, that's kind of a starting point for me in a realization that, how do we actually make a change there?
So what about an origin story? What about some root causes that brought us to this place?
I mean, it depends on who you talk to, right? As we've been doing that, we talk to different people. People have different perspectives on this. I'm not a historian, but I would say that as people started moving out of a hunter-gatherer space into more of an agrarian, into more of a city-style way of living, the Anthropocene, as it's often described, I would say that that is really the kind of the beginning of what we see today. And it's just continued to escalate as time has gone on. I mean, it's very evident that the modern world is a perspective or an experience that is driving us to continue to consume without any brakes being put on it. And so the question really is that where does this actually end? Where does it, where does that tipping point get to, where we actually really collectively start to realize that there is this problem? Because as you look around, even though we can talk about an origin story, most people are not even aware of any story for that matter. If you look at most people, they're hiding their heads, right? They don't want to interact with this the situation that we are describing. And I can judge that even just based on, just simple things like being on social media, that anytime I write anything where I'm saying, look, you know what, actually, maybe we have to come to the realization that modernity itself and the way that the system is structured, when we talk about hyper competition, consumerism, materialistic drive, these are the things that are causing us strife. Most people I see immediately don't want to interact with those posts. I can see that just based on the comments and the likes, it's like they'd rather not even look at it. They'd rather not even entertain it. And so, it's all in well saying, hey, these are the things that led to where we are. And I think that's important, of course. But, we've also, I think we can all agree that people tend to not learn from history. Until it's too late, until it's in their backyard, so to speak. And then suddenly people want to do something about it. And I think that's always going to be the most difficult thing to overcome.
Some people have said that's one of the great lessons of history, is that people don't learn from history.
Right. It's true, right? I mean, there's so many things that have been written about this. I mean, there's so many people that both myself and Frank have spoken to have deep insight into this. But, at the end of the day, it's exactly that, right? Until it's actually on somebody's doorstep, they don't really want to engage with it. And I understand why that is, because in order to do that, you would have to question everything that you do.
Right.
And it's much easier not to go down that road, because, just kind of stay the path, just keep doing it, just keep believing that a little bit more technology will solve all the problems that we're now facing. If we just keep doing more of this, eventually things will turn. But it's not getting better, it's getting worse. So why people think that is exactly what I believe it to be, is that people just want to hide their heads. They don't want to engage with the reality. And that's unfortunate. And I guess that's always going to be the thing for us. If we want to make a change, we want people to become awake to what we're saying, is that how do we get them to understand it? How do we get them to begin to make the changes so that ultimately it gets to a stage where there is enough mass of people on the same path to actually shift the needle, so that we can make the societal changes that we know we need to do in order to stave off what's coming down the pipeline, which doesn't look pretty.
No.
John?
You seem to focus on the human animal in much of what you talk to, rather than, for example, doing a Marxian analysis of society's problems, or focusing on a sociological approach. Why do you think focusing on the individual, on our humanity, is a critical way to approach this problem?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, the simple answer to that is that I know from my own personal experience is that when we look at what's happening and we become aware of what's out there and all the things that we know that's going wrong, it can seem completely overwhelming. And the natural tendency then is for a person to say, well, there's nothing I can do. I mean, what could one person do? But I believe that if we just start individually and we make the changes that we can, within the realms of what's possible for each of us, and that's going to be very different for each person, because it depends on where they are in their life, what access do they have to certain kinds of facilities or resources. But I do think that if we individually make a change, collectively that starts becoming something of value. And so that's one of the reasons why I've been focusing on what I keep mentioning his work, because I think it's pretty profound. But John Vervaeke talks about the ecology of practices. Mm-hmm. So what are the things that I can do, or the person next to me can do, to start changing the way that they show up in the world, that ultimately leads to, hopefully, this kind of collective understanding of what needs to be done. But I think we have to start somewhere, right? And each one of us is probably going to approach this slightly different. Like, I know, for example, like Frank is very much in favor of activism. I've never been an activist in the sense. I've never had access to activism as it typically would be portrayed. just from where I came from in South Africa, that was just never on my radar. But the one thing that I know that I can do is make a change personally. And it's those small changes. And what I've noticed is as people start making smaller changes and they kind of get used to that, then they're more prepared to make even bigger changes. And I've just seen that in my own life, that's been my trajectory, is that if I look back, there was a time when I wouldn't say I was bought into the system, but I was trying to play the game of the system because that's what I was told that I needed to do in order to be happy and successful. And I tried my hand at it. It didn't work for me ultimately. But at the end of the day, coming back to where I am now, I've started making, which started off being very, very small changes. And now I would say that those changes have become quite large in my life, so much so that it drives my meaning and what I'm willing to do and what I'm not willing to do. And that could, let me give you an example. It could be just a simple decision as deciding that you're going to be a vegetarian. And that's one of the things that myself and my partner did, right? We became vegetarians, we stopped eating meat, and then that led to a whole lot of other things that I feel that, we've actually made some profound, ground and movement in our own personal lives in a positive direction. And so I think if everybody does that, collectively, hopefully that will shift the needle. But I think the beauty of what we're talking about too is that I don't think there's one particular solution. And I think we need many people with different approaches, all with the same aim and the same goal coming together. Some people, activism will speak more to them, being part of something, a communal experience, where other people, life is just overwhelming them and they just don't feel like they have time to do that kind of thing. Or just, how can I do that? I have to survive. I have to pay the bills, so to speak, right? So maybe small actions is something that's more accessible to them.
Yeah, that seems to make a lot of sense. Humans are socially resonant with each other, right? So you've done a lot of training with some special forces and operators and those kinds of folks, and you walk into the room, it's a very different crowd, right? And so we know from human dynamics and social dynamics and family dynamics is that one person changes impacts everybody else. So in a sense, Vervaeke's inner ecology, or that self-ecology, has a huge impact, right? So small things end up having emergent properties, as we know. So in getting back to Frank's concept of what's the story, what's the story that's being told, if we look at modernism and then also postmodernism and the different stories that they tell, it seems like we're all looking to find some way out of the complex series of messes that we've made by running down this course far too far. And I think also, in a sense, you're speaking to, especially some of the stuff that you've written about the indigenous wisdom, is that we've forgotten those, if you will, the lower vertebrae in our back are out. We've forgotten the earlier steps in our evolution of who we are and our social evolution. And because of that, that lost wisdom is sort of like, imagine 100 years from now or 200 years from now, if society collapses, people are walking around in a nuclear power plant going, what's this? And they start hammering on different things they shouldn't hammer on, right? It could have consequences. And so in a sense, the mess and the predicament we find ourselves in might be related to those things, in that we've forgotten who we are and where we came from.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense. And I'm using that term human animal on purpose because I'm trying to make the point of saying that actually we're not better than any other living entity on this planet. We're all in this together. And so we need to see it that way. And I think that's, again, I don't want to over romanticize indigenous ways of knowing and being, and especially historically. Of course, they had to confront and deal with the same human issues that we've had to. But there was at least an attempt to be in communion with nature and not be separate to it. And even to the point of everything that they did was with that in mind. And I think that changes the narrative, because then the way that you view the living world is not something separate to you, but part of you. And that's an important thing. And that would be definitely one of the things that we have lost in this kind of modern world that we find ourselves in, is that people are so disconnected from the natural world that they don't even know how important that actually is. And I mean, most people go into the store and they really honestly believe that what's in front of them is infinite, that it's never going to change, that those things are always going to be there. But that's a kind of a modern kind of interpretation, and that's where their worldview is. But the worldview of indigenous people were very different. And so for me, at least, I keep thinking, well, if we can bring some of that to the foreground, if we can bring that into this kind of this discussion and say, oh, well, you know, how did indigenous people see the world, and why is that important, and how can we actually apply that in a modern context? Because, you know, here's the thing: as much as we want to romanticize the past, just based purely on how many people there are on this planet, we can't go back to the old ways. It's not possible for us to do that. And it would be great if we could, but we can't. And so we have to swim in the sea that we're in right now. So the question is, you know, what can we bring to the table to help us at least feel better about where we are and show up that we actually are flourishing, and that we're not being, you know, ending up becoming just fodder to the capitalistic machine that most of us find ourselves in.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So how about martial arts? Let's talk about martial arts, because I think that's a pretty unique perspective in these kinds of conversations, unique experience that you're bringing to the table here. And how would that apply outside the dojo? How does that apply in the world of activism? How does it apply in our struggles against large institutions, governments, organizations, that kind of thing? Are there life lessons there that we can apply in the larger world?
Well, I think for some of those, definitely you could probably speak to more than I could, Frank. But on a more kind of, I guess, simpler level, is that when we talk about martial arts, I mean, that's really what I refer to as a primal skill, meaning that you know, take the terminology out of it. I mean, definitely two things were on our minds right in the beginning. However we got here, right, whatever your interpretation is of that, did we come down from the trees? Were we, you know, brought in by divine grace? But the point is, definitely two things were going to be front and center. And one would have been procreation, and second would have been survival. And so our primal skills have been something that's been part of us since the dawn of humanity. It's something that has always been an integral part of our experience, be it for hunting, that we had to go out and actually find food, or the protection of ourselves, our family, and our tribe. And so in that sense, that's what I feel where martial arts has something of value to add. But I'm going to say this in a caveat, though, is that unfortunately, this is not how martial arts is particularly presented these days. You know, I could go off on a tangent on that, but just simply speaking is that in most people's kind of minds, when they think about martial arts these days in the modern world, it takes two interpretations. One is the hyper-competitive model, where it's all about competition, and the other one is all about what they call reality-based self-defense. And the idea of, you know, using martial arts to take on the martial arts of everyday life has been lost. And again, that just speaks to where we are, you know, in this modern era, in the mainstream kind of environment, where everything we're going to do are going to be interpretations of the very problem we're trying to fight. And I think most martial arts people don't see it that way. And the way that I'm trying to approach it is saying, okay, but there is this innate aspect of us, that survival archetype that has always been there. And it wasn't just about survival. It was also through that experience that we were able to learn certain character traits, right? If you think about people going out, or hunter-gatherers going out on a hunt, it was something that had to be done, you know, with foresight. It had to be slow. It had to be present. You know, you had to be present when you were doing that. You had to be patient. You had to build resilience, because it could take a day, it could take a week, it could take a month, you know, whatever that may be. And so there is these inner characteristics that come out of someone when they're engaging in a primal skills environment. And so that's why I think it's a very powerful practice. Again, the obstacles that I face on this is that trying to get people to see that. It's almost like I'm in the wrong time, because if I was talking about this in the 60s,
Right,
most people would be nodding their heads and going, yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. And they'd want to be a part of it. There's a resistance even to that I see in the modern world, because it's exactly what I noted. People want to go one or two ways, right? the world is so incredibly unsafe, and I have to learn how to protect myself. Forget all this philosophy stuff, just teach me how to fight. That's the one side of it. Or, I'm going to just push towards these competitive accolades because, that's what we say we need to do. We need to compete, and it needs to be a sport. And that's where they're going. And that's why I call them combat athletes. I don't even see them as martial artists. So, for myself and from my teaching is trying to find that balance point where we can, yes, of course, you want the skills, you want to be able to protect yourself, but can you actually also take those lessons that you are learning on the mat, so to speak, into your everyday life? And I think from there, it actually starts creating something of value.
Isn't one of the positive things about the martial arts approach, however, is that it acknowledges the need for conflict, and that
Yes.
and that we can spend a lot of time getting people, how should I put it, acclimatized or agree that we need to change the way we think. And even if, say, in the Western world, 80% of people decided, I'm going to be a vegetarian, I'm going to follow indigenous ways, I'm going to step away from the capitalist system, they wouldn't be able to do it because the people who have the power would stop them. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that there's an inherent conflict there that somehow needs to be addressed when we tell people that they need to change their lives. In other words, I'm wondering how far you can isolate the need for action from the need to change. Maybe that's just my Extinction Rebellion approach, but it just seems that action is inherent in change. In fact, I'd also argue that going through the action itself could be as powerful as any learning process. In other words, meeting with 4 or 5 people, forming an affinity group, deciding you're going to break the law, blocking the entrance to say an oil dump or to a government building, getting arrested, that could be as powerful of a change force as studying other ways of life. So I think I struggle with in these type of discussions is where, how do you combine, or where does the thinking end and the action begin, or is that even the right way to look at it? And what are the components of an effective program? And perhaps Frank's idea comes in about martial arts.
Yeah, I think that's all valid. I suppose it comes down to what's whoever's running this experience, what is their perspective, what is their philosophy, what is their worldview. So, for example, if you were a student and you came to train with me, what I'm trying to get you to embody is actually the opposite of what most people would think a martial art experience should be about. It's kind of just reaching back to what I said earlier. Most people think that if they come in and train with me, that I'm going to teach them how to fight. And by the very nature of teaching them how to fight, what I'm actually asking them to do is use their innate aggression in such a way to achieve an outcome. Mm-hmm. When I say to them, well, in actual fact, what I want you to be is I want you to be the complete opposite to that. I want you to be able to be calm. I want you to be focused. I want you to be present. And I want you to overcome the aggression inside, because that speaks to a point of self-preservation that is different to what is typically presented, like I said, in the hyper-competitive model. I don't actually want to use my martial skills at any point in time if there is another way to deal with the situation. Right. And in actual fact, what people learn when they're actually dealing with interpersonal violence is that in most instances, violence versus violence just makes things a whole lot worse, right? So if I come in with an aggressive attitude, then, and somebody's basically, pissing me off, and I come back and I'm aggressive, all that I'm going to get is a whole lot more of what I don't want. Actually, what I want people to be completely calm, centered, and focused in that moment in time, and find another way to deal with the situation. And so I'm trying to get people on the mat to embody a completely opposite experience. I actually want them to, through the experience of actually doing the martial action, to learn how can they be calm, how can they be centered, how can they be more present in that moment in time, which is almost the antithesis how typically martial arts is often taught, especially in the modern versions that are now available, right? Where the objective is to teach people how to fight, and the goal is, irrespective of what you need to do, you need to find a way to win, and that winning is always in the physical realm. Where in actual fact, most of the time, just walking away from an altercation is often the best, the best strategy. One, you don't get into the situation in the first place, right? But second of all, you've used a kind of approach that doesn't require you to actually get physical with somebody. It's like what Bruce Lee said, I've mastered the art of fighting without fighting. And so that's again, though, is very different, because if you say to people that you should only ever use your fighting skills if and when there are no other choices but to use your fighting skills, that is quite unique in this modern day. Ironically, is that, historically that wouldn't have been if you were just practicing it for self-defense, is the way it's typically presented. But in the modern world, that would be an anomaly. I mean, there's actually an entire movement to not want to actually engage in what I'm talking about. Like most of the people in the modern martial arts world just purely want to learn how to fight. And so it's driven from fear, and it's not driven from confidence. It's just a fear perspective. But that's also what society is creating, right? Society is creating us into these fear-based, individuals where we constantly think that everybody's out to get us. And so naturally, then if we gravitate to a martial arts experience, then all we want to learn is how to fight. And then you have somebody like me that comes in and goes, hold on a second, there's another way to do this. In actual fact, that's the thing that most people don't talk about in the martial arts world, especially if we start talking about self-defense, is that the vast majority of people that train in martial arts are not in the barrios or the favelas, or, like for where I come from, South Africa, in the townships. These are not the people that are doing martial arts. Ironically, the people that do martial arts training tend to be the people that are affluent. They don't need it, and are living in parts of the world that actually are the safest. So there's even a discussion there, like, and I've had this discussion. It's not a popular discussion, but I'm like, why is it that people in the safest parts of the world are learning the most extreme, perverted versions of self-preservation skills? So, like I said earlier, they call it reality-based self-defense. That says something, right? It says something about society. Like, you don't even need it. You will never probably use it. So in my teaching is like, okay, well, what you will do is you will have to take on the martial arts of everyday life. And that could be just a toxic work environment. It could be, just dealing with people that are just, ill-tempered. And so can I stay calm in that moment and deal with it in a way where I'm not kind of, buying over to my aggression? And that to me is a much more holistic and more ethical way of dealing with the situation.
And how can you use that approach to effectuate social change?
So again, I'm speaking from my own experience. When I grew up, where I grew up was on the south side of Johannesburg. So that's government housing. The only way I can describe it is like the projects in the United States. So as with any of those kind of disimpoverished environments, gangs were rife, broken families. Mine wasn't any different. My mom was a raging alcoholic. She was abusive. I had to have routes to get home from school safe, because if I didn't, I'd get annihilated by the gang on the corner. So I grew up in an environment where it was very evident to me early on as a young child that the only way that you deal with a problem, or if you want to solve something, you use violence to solve it. And so that's kind of what I became. And I imported that into my entire life, because that's how I thought you should approach things. And it was only through the martial arts experience and through my own understanding and learning that I started to change. And so I started to realize that in actual fact, there are other ways to deal with these kinds of situations where I would have never have considered before. And so when we talk about social change, I mean, just the martial arts experience of approaching it in the way that I'm describing, where my whole purpose is approaching it in the sense that I don't want to be aggressive, that I want to overcome the aggressive nature inside. I want to look at my shadows. I want to overcome the darkness inside. The opponent, like they always say, right? The greatest opponent you will ever have to face is not the opponent on the outside, it's the opponent on the inside. And as I learned to use my martial arts training to become more calm, more focused, more centered, and more present, I started to see how that started moving over into my everyday life. And so now my interactions with people were more in line with that. And I think anybody would agree that if you are showing up in life when you are dealing with people, that you are approaching it in a calm, focused, centered, and empathetic way, the outcome, especially if you're in a disagreement, is always going to be far more fruitful than if I just approach it just from an aggressive standpoint. So that was my kind of trajectory. The learning process for me is coming from an environment where everything gets solved with your fist to realizing actually the best way to solve any kind of disagreement with somebody is to actually sit down and find common ground. So that's what it did for me. And then I'm trying to do the exact same thing for the students that I have on my mat.
Well, let's talk about Just Stop Oil, because I don't know if you've been watching some of the video clips that have been coming from their various actions. And on one hand, they're incredibly inspiring because these are people who go out in the street, they blockade the street, and talk about calm. It's absolutely incredible how calm these people are when they're faced with the counter protesters who come and drag them off the street. I mean, this is Gandhian nonviolence, and it's incredibly inspiring. But on the other hand, we have to talk about tactics and talk about, well, is this a way to change things? Is this the way to move the needle on the world? Is this martial artistry? I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's a good tactic, but on a personal level, these people really are inspiring. So have you developed any ideas about this?
Who are you asking, Frank?
I'm asking, well, all of us, but you in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to kind of frame this, like how I think about it. I think
is blockading a road a good idea? Is that going to change the world? Is that going to change the flow of fossil fuels? Is that a hard style? Is it a soft style? Is it effective?
Maybe I could put it in perspective.
Yeah.
And then perhaps it would be easier for you to comment. The theory is this, is that at this stage in the struggle, the nonviolent struggle, that activists need to do shocking and disruptive things to get the concern about climate annihilation out. And, having reasonable blockades and maybe going to a government building isn't doing that. So therefore, the decision was made to disrupt the common person. Blocking a highway, for example, or abusing art in a museum, which is another extreme of this. So what they do is they go out and they block a road, and in some cases, especially if it's planned poorly, like what happened on the cases that they don't call the police when they start it, so the police aren't there to protect them, then they get attacked by the motorists. But from the perspective of that group of climate people, even that is a good thing. That in fact, it's probably necessary to have these attacks, as took place in Birmingham in the in the 50s and 60s with Martin Luther King. And so it may be that this isn't a good strategy in other contexts, but the question I think Frank is raising is, even in this context, is this a reasonable theory? Is it really Gandhian nonviolence, in fact, to disrupt people that aren't the cause of the problem? And that's the issue that's, and it's, there's a number of groups very effective, especially in Europe, that are doing this, as well as a few here in the US.
And if I can add two things to that. One is that the whole idea is to shift the Overton window of what's acceptable to talk about and what's important to talk about. And the second thing is that it does move people along the Kubler-Ross grieving levels from, denial about climate change, for example, into anger about those damn climate activists. So it does move people out of denial, in a sense.
Mm.
But whether it moves them to become activists at this point has not, doesn't seem to be the evidence to indicate that true or false.
So I would just think that after, just as somebody who's practiced martial arts for all my life and have taught for over, 3 decades, I would say that, I have the kind of the quote unquote stereotypical person that comes to train with me, who would be those people that would get really upset with the climate change activists doing what they're doing. Mm-hmm. I would make the argument that I don't think it makes any difference in the long run, because what it really does is it just upsets people. And we need to understand why those people are getting upset. I think the fundamental bottom of this entire thing is that it's like, does a fish know it's in water? Most people are not, I suppose there's varying degrees, of course, but I think for the vast majority of people, they don't necessarily view the modern world the way that we are describing it, or even those activists see it.
Right.
They actually see it as the norm. That is their normality. They have bought completely 100%, hook, line, and sinker into that narrative, that if they do the things that modern society says they should do, that will equate to happiness. In a very simple form, and we've already mentioned that, would be, okay, I need to achieve materialistic wealth. Mm-hmm. I need to compete. And it's only through beating somebody else, right, that I'm going to level up. And then I'm going to be better than them. And so then that society will see me as somebody as better than them. The idea of consumerism. I need to have those particular things in order to say that I actually have arrived, whatever it may be. For some people, it's their midlife crisis and they go out and buy a Porsche, right? Or the Prada handbag. Right. And so they're so bought into it that I think they get so annoyed by the activists that actually what it does is it doesn't necessarily open them to being understanding or to see where they're coming from. They just get angry. And so they get more resistant to it and they just get pissed off. That's why maybe again, I don't follow this particularly, but just what I've seen is that I saw where there were activists, just being, doing peaceful protests, blocking up, roads and so forth. Initially, it was they were just being dragged off, right? But now it seems that there's more aggression from the other side. It's no longer just dragging them off. It's like to the point of like there is actual physical assaults happening, right? And that just tells you that people are getting more and more annoyed by it. We have to find a way to get people to care. I'm not sure if that strategy is going to get them to that point where they would care, if that makes sense, right? So again, that's where I see the ecology of practices are very, very helpful. For example, I take people out into the natural world and I take them into nature. Well, as nature does something for them on a personal level, let's say, for example, a person has been struggling with stress at work, and by me taking them out into nature, I'm helping them manage their stress more effectively, and they're actually seeing that change in their life. Then you start seeing a change in the way that they view the natural world, from where, it was just about managing my stress, to now, and obviously I'm simplifying it, but now to actually caring about nature, where maybe they didn't even care about it before. It was just something on the periphery, but they never saw it that way. So I think the goal would be is like, how do you get people to care about it? Like actually care themselves, even if it's in a very, very small way, even if they're making small changes, the choice between having buying one of those bags at the grocery store that you can reuse versus plastic. Every time you get somebody to make that small little adjustment, I always believe that then they become open to more things. But by just basically disrupting their everyday life, where most people are already stressed out, people are already struggling, they're already, finding it hard to even just remain sane in the system, but they don't know that it's the system that's making them feel that way. And now all of a sudden you're making them late for work, and they just literally 1 or 2 days from being asked to leave because they keep, maybe they keep pitching up at work late. And now you've done this, the stress involved in that I think people just, their attitude is, this is just annoying and I couldn't care less about this. And these people are just idiots and they're just basically ruining my life. But I think that we need to find a way to get people to care. And the only way that I can see that happen, at least what I've tried to do, is to try to make small incremental adjustments in people's lives that deals with what they're struggling with right now. And if you can make that change, then they become open to other things and using ecology of practices that they may not have thought about before. I mean, just on a simple thing like martial arts, most people wouldn't have thought that if they came into a martial arts environment that actually that's going to help them manage their inner turmoil better. That's going to make them calmer. And so if they're calmer through that experience and they go into the everyday life, now they feel that they're more calmer dealing with just their toxic boss, as an example, right? Or if I take them out into nature and I help them manage the stress that they're under in their work environment, now all of a sudden that evolves into something more than just I'm going into nature just to manage my stress. I mean, people talk about having, transpersonal experiences in nature, but that wasn't their initial goal. If you look at most people, when they come to nature, it's because somebody has told them that it would be beneficial for them and they've come into that experience. And then through that experiences, it's opened up and evolved into something far more than they initially thought. So that's just, I don't know, I went off on a tangent, but that's kind of like a couple of thoughts in my mind about that.
Let me just, even though I personally have some concern about these strategies, I feel obligated to defend them, at least to an extent. And just to put it in the perspective, there was the belief that the Amazon has already reached its tipping point, and that the lungs of the earth will no longer be able to stop the carbon that's accumulated. And there's significant evidence that by the early 30s, the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer. And the traumatic effects of these two things will have the impact of baking in the heat that exists to where we will be 4 to 5 degrees above pre-industrial by the middle of the century. And their attitude is, we don't have time. We need to be disruptive as possible now. It's all that we have left. And maybe they're wrong, maybe they're right, but I mean, there is some significant scientific, evidence that it's really time to pull out the stops. Your point about whether the attention that they're getting leads to anything constructive is certainly a good point. And there's, really important climate activists such as Rupert Reed, who raises this exact point. I mean, he says, no, wait, hold on. We don't have a choice. We need to be more moderate. But it's just an interesting. And I had one question for you. I don't know, are you familiar with Dr. Timothy Morton? And Dr. Timothy Morton is from Rice University. He's written some good books, including Dark Ecology. And he focuses on the idea of the severing. In other words, for thousands of years, humans have severed from the non-human world. And I couldn't help but think of Dr. Morton when I read some of your blogs, in the sense that it seems you're raising a somewhat similar point, in the sense of stressing that
we are humans, and we're not acting like humans anymore. In fact, we can't act like humans anymore. Would that be an accurate summation of what I'm thinking, or am I completely off base?
No, I think you're totally on base. Absolutely. I think also is like, if we understand human psychology, we also know that when you tell somebody that they're doing something wrong, their natural reaction is to be defensive. And so, in a way, what I see the activists doing, and I'm not saying that what they are, being the activism that they are doing isn't correct. I mean, they're fighting a good fight. They're fighting for something extremely important, which is the extinction of this entire planet. I'm not denying that at all. It's just that when you tell people that they are wrong, and that's how people are perceiving it, their natural reaction is to resist. Right. They hide, and they don't want to interact with it. They don't want to even go down that road. And so I keep thinking, well, what is the alternative to that? Like, how can we get them to see that perspective? And I keep coming back to this idea of how do we get them to care? Like, how do we get them to really give a shit? And it may not be that we need to get them initially to care about the big things, because again, that's so overwhelming. You think about just the idea of just thinking about this whole thing, the trauma involved in it, when you really put your mind to it and you look at what's really going down, it's so overwhelming, even for somebody like myself that I'm in it and I'm trying to make a change. It can be so, it makes you feel disenfranchised. It makes you feel like you can't do anything, right? It's like, well, where do I start and what difference can I make? I'm just one individual. But maybe if we can just get people to care about the small things. And I know we don't have time, and I get that part, but I don't think by shoving the big things down people's throats is going to make them want to make the change that people think we know that they should. I just don't think it is, because you're basically telling them that they're also the problem. You're telling them that they're wrong. And when you, like I keep saying, when you do that to people, they immediately shut off. I mean, even as a martial arts teacher, I know that. Like, if you want to get the best from somebody on the mat, and I know that what they're doing is wrong, the approach is not to tell them that. It's to find another way around it, right? To get them to come to the realization themselves and say, hey, I can see you struggling with this particular experience right now. But what happens if we approach it this way? What happens if we try it this way? And what is the experience then? How does that change for you? So I think, again, how do we get people to care?
Right. You raised.
I love that approach, because that is what's lacking for a lot of people, is the care. I have a friend who's a singer-songwriter, and he writes a lot of songs about the earth, and he's something of an activist. But the way he describes it, he says, my job description is to get people to feel. And that almost knocked me over when I first heard that. I was thinking, yeah, we tend to traffic in charts and graphs and data and scientific reports to tell people about the situation. And he said, no, my job is to get people to feel and to care, of course. So that's, I love that approach. And as far as tactics go, I've come to the conclusion that we need all of the above, right? We need the disruptors, and we need the people who take other approaches as well. Let's get them all on board, because every approach has some merits.
Mm.
Yeah.
I'm kind of struck by this, because I think we're all sort of feeling our way around the elephant, if you will. And the idea is that we're sitting here with a predicament that is an existential, rapidly accelerating, exponential series of meta crises, right? And it starts with meaning, and it starts with, we've come so far, as you said, we're so separated for so long that we've lost our way, and we've lost the way of the way, the Tao of the way, right? And ideally, from a martial arts perspective, we take a Sun Tzu and say, the best way to win the fight is to not even to fight, but to win it before you've even had to raise your fist, right? as you said, to even to just walk away, to use the higher level capacities, mental, emotional, spiritual, and psychological. And it seems to me that right now we're faced with this imminent event, these things, these series of things that happen that, as you said early on, by the time we've passed them is when when we can move them from subjective to objective in the past, right? Then we can see them a little more clearly. But we don't have time. So that's the real challenge. So that's I think the sense of anxiety and stress that so many of the activists feel, which is why we've tried to work with the human animal and the different relaxation and self-regulation and other presencing modes and things like that. So like that ecology of tools. How do we then take all of this kind of zeitgeisty together and say, how the fuck do we get through this? I mean, literally, right? I mean, we're in this moment where people are popping up and emerging with awareness and looking to at the work that you're doing and people like you are doing and saying, are there a bunch of gemstones we can string together in a chain here and make sense of this and then find a way through?
Nice metaphor. Yeah.
No, I love that. So, I mean, this is what's really good about today, right? We've met and we've had a conversation and we're talking and we kind of just, trying to kind of just feel the sense of what's going on. And I don't proclaim to have all the answers and we're just kind of having a discussion. I guess what we need more kind of situations where we actually are able to highlight each other's work collectively so that more people can actually access it. And so I feel like sometimes we tend to be siloed, where we've got this person over there and they're doing this and another person over there doing that. And there's something for a community of practices. So bringing people together, actually setting up a stage, and whatever that may be. Now, that could be a website, whatever. It could be a series of courses that people can actually engage in, that is, giving them different perspectives from different people, or at least different strengths, right? Because I feel I have a specific strength. I don't necessarily have your strength, right? I may not have that knowledge or the know-how to do that, but I can only do what I feel that I can do. And if we at least kind of come together as a community, that becomes a very powerful thing. So maybe that's something to consider, is like, how do we create that community? Because like, even if I just, I keep, obviously, because that's in my immediate experience, if I think about martial arts, right? Everybody's doing their own thing and nobody's coming together. Nobody's kind of building a community based around, a specific goal and a specific thing that they're trying to achieve. And I think a lot of that has to do with ego, at least in the martial arts world. And so if we can put that aside, how do we each bring what we have to the table to a much wider audience? And I think that's really an important question to consider. But then whatever we put forward should be done in such a way that it's accessible and that it is practices that people can actually integrate, at least as best as possible, as easily as possible, into their everyday life. For example, I'm busy writing a book right now. It's called Wild and Free in the City. And it's 24 practices that people can do to reconnect to the natural world, even though they live in a city environment. But that's a good start, right? Because at least then it's going to start making them kind of view this thing in a broader way. And the first part of the book, I actually write about, how did we get here? How did we become disconnected from nature? Because I think that's important for people to understand, just for their own kind of, experience within this. But probably what's going to be far more important is the fact that I am actually offering them practices that they can actually put into their everyday life. And I think that's where people become empowered, because then they don't feel so overwhelmed. They can, well, I actually am doing something. I actually am doing these particular things that will ultimately, make me be a better human animal, but also will impact the earth in a positive way.
Wow. Awesome.
Nice.
Yeah, that's really cool.
And I mean, I have that's the thing, and Frank knows this, that's the one thing I'm pretty good at, is I actually have the expertise to put something together, like a website and online courses. And that is the way people engage with the world these days. That's the other thing too, is that we need to go where people are. We need to, even if, I don't think the best way to do is to do this is to learn online. I'd rather have people do it with me personally. But I also know that that's not the world that we live in. We're in a world where that's how people engage with experiences. And so that's a good thing. And then at the same time is having conversations like we're having now is also very, very powerful, because, we'll all walk away from this with new ideas. And you've already challenged me on some questions that I may have not necessarily thought about or considered. So that expands my kind of viewpoint, and I have to sit and think about, it's one thing writing articles, which I do, but I don't have enough of these conversations, which I think is important, because then, you have to really think about your position and think about, what you're trying to achieve. So I think these are totally valuable as well.
Good.
Right. Every time we talk about it, we are normalizing conversation about these issues, and that's really important for everyone.
Yeah, and also, like, because Frank, you were on that call, right? And we haven't put it out yet, but we had a conversation with John Viveki, and I was saying to John in a nice way, as I said, basically, listen, I love your work, it's fantastic, but the fact of the matter is, the average person on the street can't engage with his work. It's meaningless to them. It's language that most people don't talk like that in their everyday life, right? And that's been one of my greatest difficulties too, is to not come across as an academic all the time, because I'm working really hard now to say, okay, I've written something, and hopefully that you'll see the changes over the next coming months, but how can I write this in such a way that it's far more accessible? And that's the other thing too, is that if you want to get people to care about all the things we're talking about, you need to make it accessible. Yes. In the way that they engage with the world, in the language that they typically use. And, that kind of academic jargon is just flies over the top there. I mean, who engages with that work is people who have that opportunity and that know-how and that knowledge to do it, which is not the vast majority of the human population on the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, the brick builder down the road, right? The guy that's, just building down the road he's going to listen to that for 2 seconds and just switch it off. He's going to be like, well, I don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah. Need a translator.
Yeah, exactly. You do. I need a translator sometimes. I'm listening to it. I'm going, what? And I have to go back and listen to it about 5 times to get the idea. And so I think that's also something to consider, is that, one, how do we get people to care? How do we present it in such a way that it's easily digested and easily understood, that it doesn't take too much for people to get it? Because we forget that people are so overwhelmed, and they're just trying to survive, and they're swimming in rough seas as it is. And then the last thing they want to be now is have to, use even more brain power to understand something that is very, very important, but they just don't have the energy or the inclination or even potentially the time to do it. So I think that's also something to maybe consider.
And you got to make it relevant to them individually and personally, right? Like the former director of Greenpeace for Asia came out and said, look, we've got to stop talking about the polar bears. We've got to tell people, the middle class, the working class, the modernist people, the technorati, got to say, hey, your 401k is screwed if this happens. It's like, and then they're like, what? You're not going to retire. You won't spend the money. You can't, because the system will collapse if we keep going this way. And he said that was when they started turning heads in the business class.
Yeah, that's true.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our hour. Are there any concluding remarks or questions that y'all have?
I just want to emphasize what was said earlier. This is really a helpful discussion. And to me, it's in itself, these type of roundtable discussions are a step forward. And I hope we can attract people that follow the Activism is Medicine program, and they'll be listening to this, and maybe they can raise some issues. A good talk today, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thank you for joining us and sharing your insights, your thoughts, and your ideas with us. It's very inspiring, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and looking forward to reading your book when it comes out.
Sure, no, absolutely. But I mean, look, I learned a lot today too, so that to me is a win, right? Because it was a lot of fun. So thanks for inviting me, guys.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Coach. We'll be talking to you soon, I'm sure.
Cool. Yeah, no, absolutely, man. Appreciate it.
All right.
All right.
See
Cheers.
you later, guys.
Okay,
Take
cheers.
care.
Bye.
You can learn more about Dr. King, the programs he provides, and his trainings by accessing his website and also watching his YouTube channel. I put the links on the screen here. Thanks again for watching this video.